Welcome to the No Limit, No Boundaries UFO podcast. Veteran UFO investigators Dan Spell and Mike Pinicello take on all aspects of the UFO phenomena with insight and honesty. It's all fair game here. No limits, no boundaries. And now, here are your hosts, Dan and Mike.
Welcome, everyone, to our podcast. Tonight, Mike and I are going to be discussing the long-held belief by many that the Nazis had UFO technology and had set up a base in Antarctica with the help of extraterrestrials. Mike, how's it going, buddy? Good to see you again.
Hey, good to see you too. It's been a while.
Yes, it has. You ready to talk about Antarctica a bit?
I am definitely ready. I like this topic. I think this is one of my favorite topics in ufology, this and the secret space program. And you could always tie the two together, but we're not going to do that in tonight's show. But I was really looking forward to this one.
Excellent. So not long after the war, Mike, this theory was proposed by a Hungarian living down in Argentina, Ladislav Szabo.
Mm-hmm.
He claimed, as have many, that Hitler actually did not die in that bunker in Berlin, but survived the war and was taken down to Argentina on one of two U-boats that made it down there. And from there, he lived for a while, and then with the help of surviving members of the Third Reich and ETs, they set up a base in Antarctica. That's one of the very early proponents. Have you heard of him?
I haven't heard of this particular individual, but I've heard of the conspiracy before that. They call it New Swaziland, I think?
Yes.
Down in Antarctica.
Uh-huh.
And I've heard a lot of different variations of how this particular Nazi base came into existence and then later became known as the Breakaway Civilization, because they became so advanced that they no longer are kind of in our evolutionary track. They're more advanced than us. I heard that they came from that it was started up in Germany prior to the war, and then that technology moved down to Antarctica. That's the most common one I know of.
Mm-hmm.
The one that you mentioned in our podcast today, I haven't. The background research you gave me was pretty illuminating. I didn't really know that side of it, but
and you're talking about that research paper that was done by someone at Oxford University, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a very thorough paper on this very topic.
It's very good, and we should put a link to it in our show notes, so if people want to read it, they can. And I will do that when I post our podcast.
We can do that.
So that's the way I heard of this conspiracy theory, and I think and I could be wrong, but I think it's the most common view of it is that the ETs came, or they got a crashed UFO, either
Mm-hmm.
way, and then they brought all that technology down to Antarctica after the war, and from there they developed. And then, of course, there's the whole Admiral Byrd and high jump,
right?
We'll talk about later in our podcast. But
adding fuel to this fire was very real fact that a number of Nazis made their way down to South America after the war.
They did.
Later to be hunted down by the Israelis,
Yes.
who wanted to bring them to justice for their war crimes. So there's some things that lend it a bit of authenticity.
Well, that's the greatest thing. I think I might have said this in a podcast before. Now, I don't know, but I say this a lot to my group. A good conspiracy theory always has some truth in it. That's what blurs the lines,
Yes.
What is truly there.
Yes, very true.
But I don't know. You know what I do find interesting about this particular topic, Dan, is the passion people have for it.
Oh,
I don't
yes.
know about you, but there are some pretty defined camps. And those of you that are listening to our podcast are probably in one of those camps. Either yes, you believe it 100%, or no, you don't believe it. It doesn't seem like there's like a gray area in the middle where
Right.
you can kind of sort of believe, but not believe at the same time.
Right. Okay. Adding even more credence to that theory is Karl Donitz. He was a German naval admiral who, after Hitler took his own life, became the president of Germany. And the story, Mike, is that during the Nuremberg trials, Donitz, the story, I haven't seen any proof of this, but Donitz bragged about an invulnerable fortress, a paradise-like oasis in the middle of eternal ice.
Mm.
The implication being there that it was Antarctica.
All right.
Now, I guess my question about this would be, was this just the last gasp of a true believer Nazi wanting to impress the people at the Nuremberg trials, or did he actually believe that, or was he just trying to make himself and the Nazi party look bigger and better than they were?
Well, I guess my answer to you would be twofold. I think we'd have to do a little more research on what he said. Context is everything.
Sure.
And he very well could have said this line in an entire paragraph about God knows what, about God knows whatever. I am sure the Nuremberg transcripts are somewhere. I can't see how they would not be somewhere. Maybe they're open to public record, maybe they're not, but I think that would be really where we would have to start if we wanted to dissect this particular line, is if he really did say it. And if he said it, in what context was it said in?
Yeah. Did he really mean it? Like I said, or if he actually did say it, was he just bragging, or was he really being truthful to the court? Who knows?
Well, they say that. Oh,
He's
no, go
long
ahead.
gone, so we'll never know what was in his mind.
Well, I think this is where we'll have to look at the transcripts if they're out there.
Yeah.
To see what he actually said. But I do believe that in Antarctica there are like caverns and caves that are within the ice, and in theory you could warm them and create something out of it. So and Impenetrable Fortress does play to the fact that they have advanced technology that, as they say with Admiral Byrd's battle group, they got completely, not annihilated, it's the wrong word. They came back, but they lost the fight. They were completely outgunned, outnumbered to a superior force. So given the technology of the time, and if you believe high jump was true, which we'll talk about later, it would be technically impenetrable for a short period of time until our technology was able to breach that. So yeah, it's a very intriguing sentence he said.
Yeah, no, he said it. It's just, what was he really trying to communicate? Okay. So Germany's interest in Antarctica, it is a fact that Germany went down there, I think at least 3 times leading up to the war, and perhaps even after the war began, but I'm not sure. They wanted to establish a presence there in the summer of 38 and 39, using the vessel on the screen, the Schwabenland. So that much we know for sure that Germany did. The question then is, why did Germany care about Antarctica, a very inhospitable place for much of the year? Some people think it was because there may be the cold it was down there. They wanted access to resources. I had even read that they wanted had to do with whaling. They needed, I guess, the oil from the whales. There's that too. So they were definitely there early.
Yeah. You know, again, I think it started off as exploration. I don't know how to counter that. You know, I don't know how to add to that. I mean, everything you read about shows that that was their way of starting to put a footprint down in
Sure.
Antarctica. But it really is speculation
Right.
as to why they really went down there. And, you know, you could also say, well, if they needed resources, it seems like an awfully long and
Yeah,
expensive
it
way
sure
to
does,
truck
doesn't it?
resources back.
Going
Yeah.
that far to get coal or other materials.
Especially with like 1940s, well, 1930s technology. You know, it would be difficult even today, I think, although we do have mines and diamond mines and extreme conditions but our technology is a lot more advanced than it was in the 1930s. So
in the distance, Mike, from Germany to Antarctica is, I think it's like 8,000 to 9,000 miles. That's quite a journey, especially back then.
And then if you were to say, well, they needed resources, okay, I get that, but you know, they needed resources, and what did they do as a way to get resources? Is they invaded Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, and they went in to get the oil and the resources, and obviously, you know, history shows how that worked out for them. But
the
point is they didn't go overseas to get it; they went to their neighbor and established land routes with trains that are a lot cheaper and more efficient than moving them by boat.
Right.
So
the big one.
Yeah.
The 1947 post-war battle in Antarctica involving a large number of American ships, planes, and men. Now, this legend, based on the research that I did, came out of a 2006 Russian documentary, at least a big chunk of it. That the Americans sent a Navy fleet down there to find and destroy a hidden Nazi base in a place called Dronning-Maudlin. And while down there, they encountered what's called a mysterious UFO force that attacked the fleet and that Admiral Byrd was in, destroying several ships and a significant number of planes. Is that pretty much the story that you're familiar with?
That is. And then to add to that, wasn't there some documentary where supposedly Admiral Byrd was talking about it?
Yes.
Himself, out of his own words.
He was interviewed by a media, I don't know if it was a newspaper or a magazine down in Chile, where that famous quote that we're going to get into a little bit later shows up, where he talked about the U.S. being prepared for basically attacks coming from either pole.
You know, dissecting this a little bit, you know, I'm looking at, we look at everything now in the 21st century where we have like instant communication. I mean, we can watch wars now as they happen in real life. And you're going back to 1947. Antarctica is about as remote as you could possibly go back then. And it would be very easy to keep a major battle from ever being exposed because, you know, there's no press and you control whatever press is on there. You control the narrative. So I can see how, you know, both sides, well, obviously, if it's a breakaway civilization, they wouldn't go out and tell anyone, hey, we're out here. But I could see how the U.S. military could keep that quiet. The only thing I would throw a little bit of hammer, and I understand that, you know, servicemen and women, they take an oath, they follow their security clearances and then all that. But to circle back to the famous one of Roswell, you know, for so long, these men and women kept their security oath. The government told them, you know, be quiet, don't talk about this, and they did. And then you have them on their deathbeds talking about this, basically like they have to tell what happened. And you know, there's great researchers out there that wrote some very excellent books of hundreds of eyewitnesses, all different walks of life in the military, all giving similar stories as to what happened. And I think the Roswell story, I think most people would say there's enough circumstantial evidence to say that it was something happened, and there's enough people that came forward at the end of their lives saying, I'm going to tell my story, because at this point, what is the government going to do to me? They can't take my pension. I'm dying anyway. Bringing it back to this Roswell, I mean, this Antarctica battle, why are we not seeing that now? Like, okay, maybe a great majority of them would have kept their security clear oaths and, you know, kept quiet. But there's not really any of the thousands and thousands of men on those ships of the battle group. No one talked. No one came out and told their story, and then no one else followed. I mean, look at the sieve of Roswell sightings and stories that have come out over the years, and yet nothing has come out regarding the 1947 UFO battle in Antarctica.
So then that begs the question, Mike.
Yeah.
Why not? Is it because they're adhering to their non-disclosure agreements, which is lifelong, by the way, or is there nothing there? It didn't happen. There was nothing for these sailors and airmen to talk about. Yeah, we went down there. A couple people died in a plane crash. You know, we looked around and you know, the weather got bad and we came home. There's not a whole lot to say there. And,
you know, the security clearance are lifelong for the Roswell people too. Yet they're all talking. Well, not they're all, shouldn't say all, lump them in, but a lot of stories have come out from people that have experienced it. So that kind of makes you think a little bit, like you were saying, maybe really nothing did happen, because if they're willing to break their security oath and say, I saw 3 little gray alien bodies on the ground in the desert in New Mexico, and you're telling me that no one will say, I was standing on the deck of a battleship or a destroyer, and these 2 UFO saucers that went over my head at incredible speeds and destroying our planes left and right, no one would come out and say that? Yeah, it's hard to believe, isn't it? It is. Possible, but very hard to believe. And then there's some details about Operation High Jump, and that is the fleet that we're talking about that went down there. Chester Nimitz, the chief of naval operations at the time, issued these orders to the fleet. They were going down there to basically train Navy people and test Navy ships and aircraft in the frigid zones of the Antarctic. Makes sense if you want to compete in that realm, you know, for resources. Yeah, you want to be able to show a presence there. And that second bullet says that very thing. And then they want to determine if it's even possible to set up a base in Antarctica. That's pretty ambitious set of goals. Yeah. There. And you'll notice, of course, it does not say anything about Nazis, whether alone or with UFOs. But before we began the podcast, like you were talking about, and you can jump in here, and you're talking about technology, about equipment and meteorological effects down there. Yeah. So I found on one of the UFO websites the a PDF document titled "Observations of Radar Propagation and Influencing Meteorological Factors During the 1946-47 Arctic Expedition," and it was dated June 10th, 1947. It was 18 pages. And I apologize for not getting this to you. I literally found it before I left work in
That's
between
okay,
meetings.
no problem.
And the idea being is that, according to the summary, is Admiral Byrd's Arctic expedition offered an excellent opportunity to study radar waves, propagation, low-level meteorological conditions. It had the report deals with radar and meteorological measurements that were made during the cruise of the Western Task Force Group. Most of the information was collected, made available when they were using helicopter aircraft, PMB aircraft. So it really, this article, this document, and we'll put it in the show, I'll put it in the show notes as well, really does show that this was more of a scientific research thing. Like, let's see what our technology can do in the colder
Right.
weathers.
Exactly.
And one of the things we were talking about off the air and during the show prep, and we were trying to figure out how best, to answer this, is where it says establish American presence or sovereignty over the Antarctic. And you were saying maybe they just went down, show that they could go down there. And then my counter argument was, okay, you could go down there, show that you can make it down there, but you're not really creating sovereignty on it because you're leaving. Another country can come.
Right.
You would want to set up some kind of base. They had destroyers and planes and men. You could leave a company of men down there, or a division, or whatever. At least set up some kind of base to claim your stake. And but then I just thought, and what we kind of agreed on is that, well, maybe it was more of like what they're doing in modern day Taiwan and China, where it's a freedom of navigation. We can show that we can go down there, but we're not really gonna do anything about it, and that makes sense.
There were benefits to definitely going down there, for sure.
Yeah.
And take a look at that next to last bullet. Establishing and maintaining air bases on the ice,
Mm-hmm.
with particular attention to applicability of techniques to Greenland. Well, after the war, the United States has developed a huge presence in Greenland.
Yep.
With the approval of course, of that government.
Yep.
So maybe whatever they learned down there, sometime later, they put it to good use up in Greenland.
And again, putting this into context, 1946-47, the Cold War was just starting to get up. Russia is a cold weather environment. There was a lot of thought that, Russian winters are notorious. The Russian winters beat Napoleon. The Russian winters beat Hitler.
Yes.
If the U.S. was going to have to fight on a Russian winter, they would need to know how to survive, how to navigate. So this really could have been just a way to start getting ready for their next adversary. And Greenland became an important stop because of the Russian submarines.
Yes, exactly true. Good point. Now, start doubling back a little bit on the theories that what has helped this legend propagate so much was Ernst Zundel, a German scientist who turned author, who entered the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. He wrote a book called Nazi Secret Weapons, claiming that UFOs were in fact secret Nazi weapons developed during World War II, and that some of those UFOs had been shipped out towards the end of the war and hidden at the poles. And then in the bottom is a reference to one of the 2 U-boats that made it down to Argentina. One of them was U-530 that had taken them to Patagonia, or what they described as a new Berkeley's garden in Antarctica. So again, when I look at what Zindel wrote, I think he may be just another Nazi after the war who wanted to keep the alleged superiority of the German race going by writing this type of stuff.
It's very possible. Because I guess my question, people listen. Yeah, we are UFO researchers. We're not the skeptics, even though we're kind of tearing this apart. But I would think it does sound a little propaganda because if this was true and you had that, you wouldn't want to announce to the Americans or the Allies, hey, we have a whole other base down in Antarctica, come get us, or I mean, that seems a little counterproductive if you just lost all of mainland Europe and you lost the war, to come and say, hey, we have a backup base, backup weapons here. But I could be wrong on that. So yeah, I agree with you. It does seem a little more like it's propaganda in some respects because they're talking about it.
Yes, but there are people, Mike, out there all over the world who read books and articles like this and say, oh yeah, man, it's got to be true. He wouldn't have written it if it wasn't true. Well, you got to take this type of thing with a grain of salt. And as we go along here, we're going to show some images of what Germany looked like at the end of World War II and the technology that they actually did have and were striving to get.
Yeah.
So
yeah. No, I agree with you. A lot of the books out there are not sourced. They're just stories of people, and you're like, well, I could go out and make up a story today.
Absolutely true.
There's no way you could disprove it.
And that's just, again, reiterating what we talked about earlier. But that these were secret weapons of the Germans, not necessarily ETs flying them, but these were, in fact, German UFOs. Albert Bender, another gentleman who has helped spread the UFOs in Antarctica story. He created an organization called the IFSB, the International Flying Saucer Bureau, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, not far from you, Mike.
It's only about an hour away.
Claimed that aliens took him to their underground headquarters in, you guessed it, Antarctica. And of course, red-blooded American at the base, he saw beautiful female aliens, and of course, a few aliens who were male.
Yeah.
And that just makes me laugh. There, I don't know that many people have seen beautiful female aliens, but who knows? Maybe you did.
Well, was a correct me if I'm wrong, and I might have, maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, but Travis Walton, didn't he say when he got abducted, he saw a female that looked humanoid and she was attractive?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because I remember his
kind of a Nordic is it?
Yeah, it's a Nordic, because I remember seeing his PowerPoint presentation at a conference, and he had I believe he had a woman up there, and she looked very beautiful. So, and they do say, they being other abductees, that the Nordic men and women are
Right.
gorgeous. They're
Right.
not, they're like perfect specimens of,
Yeah.
of what a supermodel would look like. I mean, it's the
Unlike
best.
us mere humans, we're not,
Yeah.
we're just average looking. But
But
go ahead.
Albert Bender, there's another book out there that talks about him and his encounters with the Men in Black. And
Exactly. Yep.
the Men in Black basically, he kind of went crazy. So I don't know if
There were 3 of them. The story is that Albert Bender, he had been publishing that journal about UFOs,
yeah,
and he was paid a visit by 3 men in black.
yeah.
And the story is that Albert Bender asked them about UFOs, and he wanted to know if what he was learning was true, and they confirmed it for him. But they said, basically, it's in your best interest to stop what you are doing. And shortly thereafter that, he shut down that IFSB. That's the story. That's the legend of it. Other people believe he concocted the whole thing because he was running into financial problems. So who knows?
Who knows?
But
Other
one of the
people will say
things,
that the financial problems was just him being, the government smearing him because
Yeah.
he was on the truth, and they're trying to discredit
Yeah.
him. You could go any way on those.
Right. But take a look at that quote at the bottom, attributed to Albert Bender. It says, the purpose of the base in Antarctica was to extract chemicals from seawater to send back to their home planet.
What
They
chemicals?
told Bender that if we attacked them, they could detonate all of our atomic weapons. Now, if extraterrestrials have the technical expertise to perform interstellar flight,
Mhm.
why would they need anything that's in seawater? Water's a pretty basic thing. H2O, in seawater, a lot of salt. It doesn't make any sense to me that, his whole story, to me,
Well, yeah.
doesn't. They could get those, whatever it is they want, anywhere.
Well, I'm just curious because I asked earlier what chemicals. I mean, there's H2O. If they're doing desalination, you could get. I mean, that's
But
that's not a
I
chemical.
would think, Mike, that desalination would be primitive to a culture, a society that can do interstellar travel or
Well, I mean,
multi-dimensional
they
travel.
could go
However
to
they do it.
any of the other planets. We know that there's moons that have water on
Yeah,
them. It's
yeah.
very common. So yeah, I agree with you. This statement doesn't make much sense.
No, it takes away from the credibility. And we only included this because he mentions Antarctica and UFOs.
Yeah.
Here's one that you and I were talking about offline before the podcast began. The Germans had actually recovered crashed alien craft or found technology in Antarctica to reverse engineer it. You were talking, Mike, about the Black Forest.
Yeah. So I heard 2 versions of this story. The first story is that the German government retrieved their version of a Roswell crash, but instead of in Roswell, they was in the Black Forest of Germany. They were able to reverse engineer that technology and eventually develop what they did. Now, this was in the 1920s and 30s. So, take that for a grain of salt. They didn't even have they didn't even have a basic rudimentary computer that worked. And they're reverse engineering technology that's going to give them anti-grav in that period of time. Okay. The other story I heard is that, and the one that's more common that seems to be prevalent in the various books that I read by different authors, is that the Germans with the Virile Society got help from an alien species who gave them the technology to develop anti-grav technology, and what eventually led to the machines and craft that will go to Antarctica. And the Nazi government, specifically the SS, weaponized that technology to use against the Allies as a last-ditch effort to win the war. But they didn't create that in time or figure out how to use it in time. But the Vril Society, and because they had alien help, were able to create that in Antarctica. And that's what eventually became the Breakaway Civilization that you so often hear on the internet. Those are the two stories for that.
So Mike, you mentioned the Vril Society. For our listeners who aren't familiar with it, can you give a little background on that? There's a woman who was a key figure in that group, right?
Yeah, and what was her name again? I can't remember her name. But she was a blonde. Yes. Again, a Nordic. Something they say she's a Nordic blonde, who was involved with leading this society, and they were, they were supposed to be peaceful and going to elevate the German society. Again, it does seem like we were talking about earlier with the propaganda of, the Germans were the chosen race kind of thing. Here they are trying to show another example of even the aliens think we're the Aryan race, the superior race.
Right.
So maybe that's just propaganda. I don't know. You can argue that either way you want, but that technology and that leadership of this person, and I'm sorry, I am terrible with names, and she is escaping my head right now.
Okay.
But she was also seen, I think, one time in the U.S. government, supposedly in the halls of the Pentagon. She's like one of those beings that are always around. But I don't know. I don't know which is true, because both of those stories have very questionable sources, in my opinion. There's nothing in the way of solid documentation. And the few documents that are out there, you can't really authenticate them.
Right.
So it's really hearsay, in my opinion. And we all know how well hearsay works.
Here's an example of alleged Nazi technology. Is both a UFO and a time machine device. It's called, what's it called? The Glock. The Glock.
The bell.
Like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Allegedly developed by Nazi Germany. And interesting thing about this object, Mike, take a look at it closely. In Kecksburg, Pennsylvania,
Maria Orsic,
several decades ago, an object, the story goes, crashed just outside of Kecksburg, PA. It had that very shape, like an acorn.
Yep.
But unlike the image there that has the Nazi swastika on it, that object in Kecksburg, PA had what the witnesses described as hieroglyphics written on it.
Mm-hmm. And incidentally,
now that's not to lend credence to this story of this Der Glock. Apparently, the U.S. government determined that what crashed in Kecksburg was not a Nazi UFO time machine, but rather was a Russian, or at the time Soviet, satellite that came down. That doesn't address the hieroglyphics on it, but that's what has been written.
Just circling back, it's Maria Orsic was the lady who was in charge of the Vril Society.
Wait, what was her name again?
Maria Orsic.
Okay.
Orsic, yeah.
Was she German?
She was supposedly the daughter of an official from Croatia and a Viennese woman.
Okay.
But they also say that she was actually the head of the alien delegation, the Nordics.
Okay.
So take your pick.
All right.
Sorry, it
That's
was
okay.
bothering me and I had to remember.
I understand. My brain works that way too. Not a problem. But at any rate, that's an example of alleged Nazi super technology, UFO time machine.
You know what's interesting about this, and I always just curious about it, is in the Bentwaters case, wasn't there supposedly hieroglyphics on the craft that
Yes,
landed?
there were. Uh-huh.
So again, is that weird thing where you have these little dots that connect to each other and you kind of wonder, well,
Yes. Yep, it sure is. Now, we can get in a little bit to what the German military and their science programs actually had and what they wanted to do. V1 buzz bombs, I think most people know about those. Are you familiar with those, Mike? They made a horrendous buzzing noise when they would fly overhead. And according to people in England, if you heard that sound, you were safe. It's when it began to fall, when it began its final entry to attack a target, is when that buzzing sound stopped, is when you had to worry.
Well,
it's roughly called the weapons of retaliation or reprisal or vengeance. I don't know what Germany was reprising for, but that's what they did. And of course, the V2, this is probably more well known. According to the records, 1,100 of these landed in England until March of 1945. And then they also had designs for an antipodal bomber, and they actually had another missile that they wanted to develop called the V4 Rheinbot. So my question, I guess, for you and for our audience is, these technologies, the V1, the V2, the V4, are all conventional rocket propelled weapons. There's nothing anti-grav in them. There's nothing, they're actually kind of dumb. I mean, they were smart for the time, but this is not extraterrestrial technology we're talking about here.
all right. Well, the believers would say that either one of two things: they weren't able to develop the technology for the secret space ships or anti-grav or whatever you want to call it in time to win the war, and they took that research and that equipment to Antarctica where they developed it. But here's the other question, and the counter to that, I would say, is okay, let's run with that. So most of these rockets were fired towards the later end of the war. It was, a couple of years before the end of the war, or the end of the war, depending on how you look. Like the high jump happened in 47.
Right.
There's not that much time for, if you couldn't get it then, you make in 3 years from 45, in 2 years to 45 or even 44, depending on when you look at when they left, you were able to make that technology work. It seems like, looking at our own development of advanced technology, it takes years, sometimes decades, to get something to work. And you're telling me you couldn't do it in 3 years. And then, so there's like, okay. The other spin to that will be this breakaway civilization left Germany much earlier. And so while the Germans were fighting it out on the mainland, they would say, well, they were down there working on this technology above the fray, so to speak. So that would be like the believer. I think the believer's argument to say like they could still do this, even though the timeline of developing Nazi weapons doesn't really jive with such a technological leap
Right.
in technology. I think that's how they being like people that would support this idea of Antarctica and the breakaway civilization and then UFOs down there would justify that leap. But I'm kind of with you. It seems very hard to believe, given just the ability of procurement of technology now, that you can't. It doesn't take 3 years. And I know it was in a war, and I know that things were moving very quickly in war. But still, it seems like, given the technology of the time, I just don't see how they could do it.
I agree with you completely. Next page is an example of what they were hoping to field. That's the Horton Ho 9 or the Ho 229 flying wing.
Yeah, and as you said off the screen, that's the B-2.
That is basically an early version of the B-2 bomber that the United States developed.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible, the similarity between the two?
And you know what else is interesting? If you were to see this, now we know that Operation Paperclip, that's well documented. That happened. You know, Kevin Arnold saw little half moon shaped objects at a distance, and that was after 47. That really could have been the Nazi technology. And so you know, I think that it just lends more credence to the fact that the technology of the time, that what you're seeing on this screen is what's the most advanced thing that they had.
Take a look at the back end of that plane on the bottom of it.
Yep.
You look at the sketches provided by Mr. Arnold, right, in Washington State. The sketches that he provided of those 9 objects he saw, the back end of them look very similar.
They do.
Yeah, and for you and for our listeners, take the time and look up those sketches online. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's uncanny, the similarity. So were you suggesting earlier, Mike, that the U.S. got that German technology and ran with it after the war?
Well, I mean, that's my contention. My point would be this, is that Operation Paperclip happened. There's a lot of documentation on it. There's a lot of good books. I mean, the German scientists built our rocket program, built our space program. It's very likely impossible that they also took some of these early prototypes of the Horton, especially since Kevin Arnold saw something very similar to it. If not the actual plane, maybe they took the blueprints and just rebuilt it here.
Right.
If this is what we were testing in 1940, when was Kevin Arnold?
47.
Okay, so 2 years after the war, right around the time of high jump, then this was the most technologically advanced craft in the world at the time, because we didn't have it and we're testing it. The Germans built it. So that doesn't look like the descriptions of what was being said was in Antarctica, is what I'm trying to get at. Like we know the pinnacle of technology at the time was probably this thing in front of us, and this doesn't match what is in the movements or the mechanics or even the shape or design of what was in Antarctica.
Right. And to me, looking at that aircraft on the screen, it looks like those are jet engines.
Yes.
It's a push technology. You're pushing the aircraft forward. It's not anti-grav or anything like that.
Right.
Yeah, they had, I mean, the examples that I showed here was just a very few. the Germans were working on probably 24 different advanced aircraft. Some never got off the drawing board. Some were in varying stages of prototyping. But yeah, the Germans were ambitious. There's no question about that. They wanted advanced technology like this Horton aircraft. But fortunately, they didn't get to finish them because they were defeated.
Right.
Now, the stats on this page, Mike, are the ones that really jump out at me as arguments as to why Nazi Germany could not have had advanced technology from extraterrestrials. Now, this is strictly their land force, talking about the army and the German army and the SS. Look at those percentages of their troop movements that were mechanized. That is, tanks, trucks, jeeps, things like that. That's horrendous. I mean, if they're not mechanized, and as the bottom example shows, they're basically horse-drawn wagons towing cannons and ammo and things around Europe. How is it possible then that a country that poorly mechanized, that immobile, would have access to extraterrestrial technology? And my question for you and for our listeners is, if they had that UFO technology, why wouldn't they have used it to either attack or to move things around, whatever the case may be? This tells me that there's no way they had it.
Yeah, no, that's a
It's
valid
pretty
point.
primitive, actually.
It is, and yeah, I the only yeah, I agree with you on that. I don't have a rebuttal to that.
No, the thing that astonishes me is about what the Germans were capable of doing, even with this level of sophistication of moving their materiel and men around. My God, they conquered from Normandy the whole way to Russia,
right?
With that level of mobility. They accomplished a lot. You got to give them that.
Yeah, no, they were
without
advanced
absolutely technology.
Well,
now, it's also important to add, though, that this is their land army. The Navy and the Air Force were probably different stories, because as we've shown, their Air Force was very highly developed. They built high quality aircraft and their ships as well. So who knows?
Yeah, I mean, looking at this, you do paint a pretty good picture of their ability at the time.
If nothing else, it should give everybody pause to think about the claims that the Germans were in cahoots with extraterrestrials and setting up a base in Antarctica.
But you know what's interesting is that I'm trying to think of what the counter argument with that would be. Of what I know of Antarctica, and I don't think there's any way to address that, because the only counter argument will be what's already said, that the aliens came, they took some of them, some of them left and went to Antarctica, and then they don't expand on anything of the facts. They don't look at this particular stats that you have, and so there's no way to counter that. I don't know how someone in who would truly believe this would say can justify aliens being involved. It would probably go into the conspiracy realm with the U.S., the U.S. has access to conspiracies galore about involvement with the U.S. with aliens,
Yeah.
and Eisenhower giving a treaty with them, and they're sharing technology, but it's locked in the black budget world. And I honestly think if you were to have like a true believer or one of the authors of the secret space program or the Antarctica books come on this podcast, he or she would probably say the same thing, that this is just part of the conspiracy, that this technology was there, but it was locked away. And you know what? I really do think that that's such a cheap answer, because it's a blanket excuse for everything. And
It
it's
is.
not
And
really looking
know
at
what, Mike?
any of the facts.
What I think UFO investigators like us should tell our teams that, and anyone who is a believer in this stuff, the Antarctic thing that we're talking about, it doesn't matter what we believe. What matters is what we can prove.
Right.
That's what matters. It doesn't matter if you believe something is real. You have to prove that something is real.
Yeah.
And that has not been, in my opinion, it has not been done. Makes for good stories and interesting reading, but it doesn't prove anything.
That's true. And then that's what a lot of these stories are. I don't know if you've read a lot of these books. And there's many, 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 many books. I'm not singling out one author or one theory, but all of these books and documentaries, there's even television, movie documentaries on this. They're all stories.
Right.
And if I was to get on my little high horse, I would say that that's what's killing our field, is that anyone with a computer now can call themselves a researcher and just pull anything they want and not source it. Do you happen to know of anyone? Because as a follow-up to this, it may be good if we could find someone who is a true Antarctic believer and have them invite them on as a guest. Like I don't know anyone in my chapter that would be my group.
Yeah, I don't know anyone either.
But if any of our audience members want to come up and try and argue the opposite to this, email us, and we'll be open to a discussion. Prove us wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Show us the evidence that aliens were in Antarctica, and that everything that Dan put together is one side of a much bigger coin.
Right.
Email us and we'll look into it. But
we welcome input like that, and reach out and contact us.
Because I do agree with you. I think when you start putting the facts on, it doesn't make any sense, especially when we were talking about the rockets. The rockets are primitive technology, but they were the most advanced thing at the time, other than the Horton planes, and they went up, then gravity took them down.
Yes, exactly.
And the procurement of advanced weaponry can make great strides very quickly, but I fail to see how in 2 years, from 1945 to 47, you could go from a prototype or a drawing board to full production of these massive ships that completely annihilated Admiral Byrd's fleet.
Right. It wouldn't happen. Nice story, but it didn't happen. Okay. So what did Germany look like when it fell? Everything, like, as you know, was ruined, destroyed by the Germans themselves, and of course by the Allies, who I mean, that was hardcore industrial age warfare that was being waged. There were no smart bombs, there were no laser guided munitions. They were dumb bombs that the Allies dropped on the German cities, and it wrecked the German military, their industrial capability, their financial institutions, their governmental structure, all of it was basically wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm about to show some pictures, Germany's largest cities, especially Dresden, that town, my God, Mike, it was horrendous what happened to them. Munich, Nuremberg, and Berlin were just ruined, destroyed, as I'm about to show.
Wow,
That's
look at
what
that.
Dresden looked like at the end of World War II.
Wow.
As you and I were talking before the show, it's a weird similarity to what Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like when we dropped the atomic bombs on those cities.
Yeah.
But this is conventional ordnance. That's Dresden. Berlin, a little bit more intact. In fact, a lot more intact than Dresden, but still very badly damaged by Allied bombing. Not only by bombing, when the Allies, the US and Britain and the Russians went into Berlin, it was ugly.
Yeah.
And the last one I have up to show everybody is Nuremberg.
Wow, look at that.
Looks a lot more destroyed than Berlin, more closely like Nuremberg. I'm sorry, like Dresden. So the point, I guess, of us showing these pictures is to illustrate what a destroyed country looks like.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for you and for the audience is, a country left in ruins like that is going to have the wherewithal, the money, the industrial capacity, the people to go to Antarctica and set up an entire civilization? I have my doubts. I don't see it. I don't see how a country that destroyed could do anything like that. And why would they allow, if they had that UFO technology, why would they have allowed this to happen? They would have used UFOs to win the war if they had that technology.
Right.
They would never have let this happen to Germany, because above all else, they were very proud people of their fatherland, Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. A valid point.
You just have to ask yourself, how capable would Germany have been to do that? I don't think so. I could be wrong. I'm always open for a counter argument, but
Well, let's see what our audience says. I'm curious how they would justify this, because you basically say if the group that left decided to, for all intents and purposes, turn their back on Germany and move to Antarctica and start their own civilization, they're renouncing their heritage and their birthright and starting over. And yeah, it given what you just said, that doesn't seem like that would be something at this time that the German people would have done. So it would be very interesting to see if someone could provide a document to that, or a statement from someone. Because again, you could tell a great story, but there's no way to prove any of that. There's no way to prove that.
And think about
why
what
they
happened
left.
on a more a positive note to this. What happened after World War II? Germany was destroyed. It took probably equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars to get Germany rebuilt. Was that the Marshall Plan that made that happen?
The Marshall, well, that was when, basically because the Soviets cut Berlin off, and they were airlifting food into the place.
Yeah.
So I think what it really would come down to is if you were to say that there was a bunch of Germans living in New Swaziland or in Antarctica, whatever you want to call it, is that this group renounced themselves from the German people and society. Yeah, sure, they kept the German heritage to an extent, but they were no longer German by or related to Germany, that they were a new civilization with new goals, new ideas, a new direction to move forward with their society, and that was to the heavens. And that's the only way I can see that you could ever justify why they would not use their technology to have either won the war or at least stop the war to an extent where they could maybe had like a draw or an armistice or something. But and maybe that would be the counter argument. Well, the group that left were looking for higher goals.
Yeah.
Still, that seems kind of callous at the same time to say that.
It does, and I think that Hitler was such a megalomaniac and tyrant. He would have used that technology in a heartbeat if he had it.
Well, he used the jets. I mean, they only
Yes.
had a handful of jets at the end of the war, but they were so desperate to win that they put the jets out.
Yep. I believe if he had that technology, he would have brought it out immediately and used it to win the war. He would not have held it back.
Especially if that technology and anti-grav, if they were as advanced as what they were saying what Admiral Byrd's fleets were experienced, they could have easily crossed the Atlantic and they could have been hitting the U.S. They could have hit every city in the U.S. unabated. There would be no way to stop them. And you're right. I think Hitler would have cherished. He would have loved that idea of hitting New York, hitting Washington, hitting our industrial areas.
In fact, I can't quote you the name of the aircraft, but they were developing a long-range bomber with that particular purpose. Hitler wanted to strike New York City, but they never got there. Thank God for that, because the war ended. But if he had that technology, New York would have been hit. I would bet on it.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Now, we're talking about the breakaway Aryan society, a new place, new civilization. All of the very senior members of Hitler's government were either killed in war, committed suicide after the war, or were put on trial and executed. This is a few of the very highest ranking German politicians and leaders. Every one of them was put on trial and executed. So if Germany wanted to set up a breakaway civilization, who was going to lead it?
Yeah.
I think it would have been the senior leadership of the Nazi Party. And as we're showing here, they didn't escape. They were captured and tried and executed.
The only thing I would play devil's advocate to this would be that what we were talking about earlier, how Germany had a split within Germany itself, where you had the Vril Society developing this technology, then the Nazi leadership co-opted it to try and use for the war effort. And they, as we've shown, they clearly didn't develop that technology.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, if you were to have a Antarctica believer on our show, I think they would say it's okay that the Third Reich leadership was either killed or captured and tried because they weren't the leadership that was responsible for creating the leadership of the Arctic Society. It was a different group under a different direction with higher goals. I think
Right.
that's the way that they being the ones that believe in this theory would justify your fact sheet here. Just playing devil's advocate to that.
No, yeah, I understand. And I took it off full screen mode so people could see the last person who was tried and executed, Ernst Kaltenbrunner.
Mm-hmm.
And there are more. This is only a sampling of the Nazi officials who were tried. And there were scores of them. And that was just at Nuremberg. I mean, the British had their own trials for Germans as well. And God only knows what the Russians did to them.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm certain that they captured Nazi leadership too.
Oh yeah, and
So,
we know for certain there's plenty of documentation out there that they also got scientists. They had their own version of paperclip.
yes, they did.
And they took a lot of them to Russia.
Yep. So then that just feeds right into our question. Okay, this so-called breakaway society down in Antarctica, Operation Paperclip would have decimated their science corps, right? The Americans got von Braun and others.
Yep.
And the Russians got their own.
Unless they left prior to the end of the war.
Yeah.
You know, you could say they saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, and they started moving out of Germany on the larger U-boats that they created. It's also speculative. There's really no way to point to anything in any kind of document. But if you were to speculate on their leadership, I would think that they moved out slowly. And then those scientists that were involved in the anti-grav technology were secret to begin with, and moved out more quickly than the V1 rocket scientists or the aeronautical. Because if that technology really did exist, you know, the scientist who is creating anti-grav technology is much more valuable than the aeronautical engineer creating the flying wing, because that's, for all intents and purposes, old technology to them.
Right.
So maybe they were a sacrificial lamb, so to speak. I don't know.
So Mike, I think we're about done with our show for this evening.
We are.
So to wrap this up, what do you think about that whole theory? If you were to rank it as a probability on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you think it is that what has been written about the Germans and UFOs in Antarctica is real? What percentage?
I'd give it like 10%, really low. And the reason I'll justify that is because the documentation that's for there being this breakaway civilization, this secret society, this anti-grav technology, whatever you want to call it, in Antarctica, there's not really anything. And what is there is stories, hearsay, and speculation. I think there's plenty of documentation that is out there that is showing that something did go on down there, but it was more of a freedom of navigation, flying the flag, doing the testing of the equipment in cold weather environments for a possible war with Russia, Greenland, than it is that there was really a base down there. I find it hard to believe. I think it's a great story.
Yeah, it's very interesting, entertaining even to read and hear about it. But
yeah, and
I'm with you. I think this has as close to 0% chance of being accurate as you can get. If I can give it a 1 or 2%, maybe at most, but not very likely.
So I would say this is a fact or fiction. I would go with fiction.
Absolutely.
But I would put an asterisk on this. It's for those of you those listeners that are screaming at us saying that we're just debunking this UFO story. We're not debunking this UFO story. What we're trying to do is show what good research should be, is that you need to follow the sources, and having a story that is unverifiable is not a source. And
Right.
this is a great example of that. There's a lot of stories that leads into speculation that then gets carried and snowballed into other
Yes.
rabbit holes. But when you actually look at the documents and the evidence that you can hold and find, the story falls apart.
It does, absolutely. That said, I would encourage everyone out there listening to our podcast to do your own research. Take the time and learn about it for yourself and draw your own conclusion. You know,
And
everybody has to do that.
yeah, and as Dan and I were saying, if you are listening to our podcast and you have an argument to show evidence that we are absolutely wrong in our conclusions, email us and we will take a look at it. And if we we'll discuss having you on the show. We are open to an opposing side.
Always, we welcome it.
So what are we doing for our next podcast?
Our next podcast, let's see. Next podcast, Mike, we are scheduled to talk about black triangles that people have been seeing around the world.
Still
Some
seeing
people,
those suckers are everywhere.
Yes, black triangles. In fact, those have been around for a very long time. It's not a new phenomenon.
No, they're
and
not.
We have the TR3B on there. That's what some people believe, that those black triangles may in fact be a U.S. military aircraft or a spacecraft, whichever.
Yeah.
Called the TR3B. The TR is short for Teledyne Ryan, the corporation that supposedly has built them.
Okay.
So we're looking forward to that. We can't wait to get together again and talk about the black triangles.
Yeah, that will be next month, August already.
Yes.
Wow, August. Summer has gone by way too fast.
Yeah, it sure is, Mike. Okay, well, everyone, thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time, everyone. And remember to email us with your opposing views, or even if you want to agree with us.